Mass graves are the new famine, the new 35,000 dead, most of whom are women and children, the new Al Ali hospital, you name it, another Palestinian piece of propaganda uh, produced by Hamas, repeated by Western media without question. Uh, and yeah, this latest one is that hundreds of bodies. You know what? Should we go straight to Hamas spokesperson Christiana Manpour from CNN and let her explain? I'll just say, welcome to the reality show day 201 of the war in Israel. I'm joined by Michael and Morgan, and unofficially by Christiana Manpour. Let's hear from her.
The State Department has raised concerns about the conflict in Gaza in its annual report on human rights. Antony Blinken called it, quote, deeply troubling and noted allegations of war crimes by both Israel and Hamas. This comes as a mass grave containing over 300 bodies has been uncovered at Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. Correspondent Nada Bashir reports on the intense grief
All right,
amongst the
yeah, Daniel, if
survivors
you
and, of
can
course,
pause it there. So first of all, maybe we should give Anthony Blinken, the airtime he deserves here as well. Yeah, human rights violations, by both Israel and the Palestinians. So he's being fair here, right? Fair and balanced, as CNN's competitor would say. Um, Okay, I need a couple minutes to say what I think without in words that are not just swear words. I'm gonna go to you, Michael, first, and by the time we come back to me, I'll try to articulate it better than it's spoken in my mind at the moment.
Yeah, well, I think first of all, the most remarkable thing is that this is the fifth or tenth time or whatever the number is of reports that Israel did something horrendous, which is clearly not true, and would never serve in any other investigation by most things that CNN does and most things that their competitors do would never pass muster, and they would not put them on the air, or they would couch them properly with it may possibly, where this cannot be confirmed, and so on and so forth. And the fact that Blinken and the Biden cohorts have suggested that there's some equipoise between Israel and the Palestinians is one of the biggest disgraces. It's like saying, that Hitler and Poland were similar, because Hitler attacked Poland, but then when they rebelled and killed some Germans, they didn't do it in the right way, and they killed some German civilians, and that was, therefore they're both at risk, or both at fault. What's shocking is that they just continue to report this way. And it's remarkable that there's absolutely no apology for all of the other screw-ups, starting with possibly the hospital disaster, which wasn't a war crime because it was unintentional. So it's okay to kill 200, 300, whatever the number of civilians in a hospital, as long as you didn't try to do it. And all the other stuff. And then the famine, where we have pictures of tons of food. We know that Hamas is actually stealing most of what comes in anyway. And now this, which was, if anybody looked at it and dug in a little, no pun intended, you would see that these graves were dug a long time ago, and they were dug by the Palestinians. And the Israelis were rightfully looking for hostages, the Israeli hostages' bodies, and they were trying to get DNA from them. It really is a disgrace. I don't know what we can do about it other than continue to call them on it. As long as we have an administration in the White House and elsewhere that wants to pretend that there's any equivalency between these two groups of people, starting from the ground up, which is that Hamas wants to annihilate Israel and create an Iranian-like theocracy in the Middle East, and that Israel is a democratic country that is striving, with troubles, but striving to create a reasonably free society, and where, frankly, Arabs have, especially Arab women, have a lot more rights in Israel than they do in any other of the Middle Eastern countries, is crazy. But as long as we have Western idiots, including Blinken and including Biden, who pretend that there's equivalence between these, we're going to be stuck with this, and our job will be just to continue to say, but the facts are different.
Morgan.
So there's confusing in the confusion in the reporting on this about who exactly is at fault for what. And the storyline seems to be that Hamas announced on Monday that they had discovered this mass grave outside the Nasser hospital, which is what Christine Amanpour says there at the beginning, that this has been discovered. However, anyone who's got easy access to Google will know that this grave hasn't just been discovered. You can go find reporting from NBC on the 28th of January of a video of the Palestinians digging this grave. And it's being reported at the time that the Palestinians are putting the bodies in the graves, because the hospital morgue is overflowing and the bodies are starting to decompose. So that's why they put them in there. Now, the Hamas allegation is that what they've discovered. Oh, Daniel says he has that video ready too. Should we just play that one for the audience?
Sorry, what video is this?
This is the video of them digging the graves back in January.
Sure.
Sure, go for it, Daniel. So we can probably pause it there. So there you go, folks. I mean, there is just all the proof that you need. You can find in 5 minutes on Google, which a lot of these news sites haven't done. Now, the reason I say there's confusion is because some people are just taking the Hamas line, which is directly contradicted by what you've just seen there, that the Israelis made this grave and buried all the people in there to hide the evidence of their crimes. Or the real problem is that the Israelis recently dug up the bodies to find any evidence of potential hostages who are buried in there. Now it's one or the other, but the news sites don't know what to go with, and the reason why they don't know what to go with is because they haven't done enough checking on this. And that's, again, as Michael was saying, it's unbelievable that they just want to go and run with it without having done the due diligence. It isn't like in journalism schools they aren't taught standards for what you should go on, report on, and all this kind of stuff, and yet they're running with this anyway. So the claims that this has just been discovered isn't true. NBC certainly knew about it back in January, and so did anyone who saw that. And it doesn't seem, and the IDF has acknowledged that yes, they did dig up the graves to look for the Israeli hostages, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to be doing. Now, supposedly, under some provisions of international law, you can't touch a grave. However, ultimately, the standards of international law are so debased that I don't think that really matters. If you want to find out if any of your hostages have been buried in the mass graves by the people in the hospital, then you should absolutely go and do that. And then once they had a look at them, they put them back. So this story, again, stinks from beginning to end. And some news sites are hedging a little bit to try and seem more responsible. But I think they should know at this point that the standards in our culture are so sloppy that people will hear any suggestion of any kind of crimes being done by Israel, and they'll completely run with it. So they have to have a much higher standard for establishing what really is a fact here and what isn't. And yet they're in dereliction of that all the time.
Yeah, and once we see when we start watching this report, we'll see how and if you look at this reporter's Twitter, she is very much, consistent in being a part of the Palestinian propaganda machine. But yeah, in this case, asking the basic questions. First of all, as Michael mentioned, why is Israel even there? This is not brought up. It's not brought up. Why? It is brought up that Israel says they dug them up for to look for hostages, but that's kind of an afterthought. The fact that hostages are still there in some cases, still alive, likely in some cases not. Israel doesn't know. None of this comes up in any of what we hear. Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Mary Aline, for the super chats. Thank you, Eitan, for the super chat. Eitan says, I heard that Palestinians dug the graves, but IDF exhumed some bodies looking for hostages. Do we know that that is definitely true? I mean, we know that that is what the IDF is saying. And I am gonna believe them over Hamas. which I know is a very controversial point of view, but I think not so much on this channel. All right, let's hear some more from this report, or actually the beginning of the report itself.
Story is difficult to watch.
For the last 10 days, this mother has returned to Gaza's Nasser hospital, searching desperately for the body of her 24-year-old daughter, Kauthar. She had been buried at this makeshift gravesite in January. Now, her body is missing. The Israelis turned the hospital upside down, she says. They dug up all the dead bodies and moved them around. These are the shrouded corpses of those retrieved from a newly discovered mass grave in Khan Yunis. More than 300 bodies have been recovered so far, according to Gaza's civil defense. But the search is still ongoing. This is a crime against humanity, Dr. Al-Maghaya says. How could the Israeli occupation forces dig up these graves and mishandle the bodies of our martyrs? In some cases, they even opened and removed the bodies from their bags, even though their names had been marked on them. Many of the bodies recovered here were buried by relatives or medics.
Yeah, Daniel, we can pause here. Yeah, it's interesting that this did she say doctor? Was that a doctor who said our martyrs? It's interesting how even that goes unquestioned. Yeah, I'm sure some of them, or I wouldn't be surprised, let's say, if some of the bodies are of actual terrorists. Not a question that's being asked. Many questions aren't being asked. One thing that is mentioned kind of in passing, and this is according to Gaza's civil defense, like they like to say, according to Gaza's health ministry, why don't they just say according to Hamas? According to the people, say whenever you are quoting Hamas, say that you are quoting the people who on October 7th broke into Israeli villages, broke into people's homes, murdered children in front of their parents in front of their children, tortured them, raped them, burned people alive. These are the people who we are now telling you, are quoting to you about what is happening and using them as a reliable source of information. Michael.
Well, it almost defies the response to this whole situation. I think it's worth reviewing what Razi said. First of all, why are we in this situation? The first reason is because there are still 133, probably mostly dead, because all estimates are that more than half of them are probably dead hostages still in Israel. And it's interesting that, when the ex-Harvard president and some of the other presidents testified in front of Congress, they mentioned that anti-Semitism has to be taken in context, and October 7th has to be taken in context, unless it's about the Jews, in which case we ignore the context. So this case, we're ignoring the context. The context is there are hostages missing, and the history of Israel has always shown that even for dead bodies, Israel is willing to trade 1,000 prisoners, 1,000 criminals from Gaza or the PA or wherever, for a dead body to get the body back, because that's the way Israel values even the bodies of its citizens, and will certainly trade for live people as well. But this is standard. So the notion that Israel is suddenly looking for hostages and that's any different than their behavior ever is ridiculous. The second point is that looking for hostages is their job, and finding out if they're dead or alive is the part of the army's job. It's part of the mandate of a successful end to this war, which is to recover all of the hostages, whether they're dead or alive. So that's absolutely indisputable, points 1 and 2. And the third one is, which also didn't get men up, is that this is not a hospital only. This Khan Yunis building may have treated some people, but these buildings are being used to store munitions, to carry out attacks, to be booby-trapped, and even for Hamas to hide out in, which is, oh, by the way, also a war crime, which is never brought up. So you have hostage taking, which is a war crime. You have the initial war crime of October 7th. You have the use of hospitals to store military equipment and to provide safe haven for terrorists. That's a war crime. And you have Israeli soldiers doing their job with as much as respect as possible in this situation. And it is true that in isolation, you're not supposed to exhume bodies. But when you are allowed to exhume the bodies of your own people, and when it's not clear if they are your own people or not, you have to exhume the bodies. So it's absurd. The last point I will just say is that, as I often say on this show, someone should find out from Christiane Amanpour what world she wants to end up in when she supports this group, when she acts like these are just decent martyrs. They're just good martyrs, because that's what they're saying. And they're showing us this wonderful mother who's been sad for 10 days. And they're not doing anything for the Israeli mothers who have no kids left or who have hostages. But even if they were, the question is, what kind of world do they want to live in a year, in 10 years? And the answer seems to be they want to live in a world where the terrorists are right and the defending army and the responding armies are wrong.
Morgan. Why she would report that clip of the guy saying, "Here are our martyrs," as if that indicates anything good about him, I don't know. Because what martyrs suggest is perhaps a bit vague, but often martyrs are used to suggest people who are fighters for Hamas. And the reporting of this mass grave is that, a huge majority are women and the elderly, which either these might have been women and elderly people who are actually fighting for Hamas, though that doesn't seem very likely, or that just isn't what they are, that there are a notable number of people amongst them who were Hamas fighters who have been buried there. So that isn't even questioned. The point about there being names on the bags, yeah, I'm sure that the Hamas people would have written the names of the hostages on there if they buried them, right? So why on earth did the Israelis need to look into the bag? All of this is just nonsensical. And from the mainstream media sources, there needs to be some real reflection on why did we report this stuff as if you can just take it carte blanche? I mean, maybe we'll talk a bit later about the UN's response to this, but why do they consistently report the anti-Israeli line and then repeat any claims from the IDF sources as if they're very suspicious? They can only be couched as possibilities. There's no evidence that their claims could possibly be right. And I think it's reflective of a prejudice against Israel. They are on the Palestinian side in all this, and they lend much more veracity to the Palestinian claims, or even if they're coming from Hamas, or to this doctor who's calling the people martyrs. It just beggars belief. But then so does so much about the reporting in this war.
Yeah, they could, of course, in that report mention any fighting that happened, mention that it's very likely that some, maybe many, maybe most of those bodies are of terrorists. But the story is told in a different way and received in a different way if you start it with a crying mother crying about her child and tell it in that way. And of course, this is why they say it in that way. Jeanette was saying in the chat, even Amnesty is believing the lies. So we did the Daily Objective before this show about the protest in Colombia because I thought it was more of an urgent story. But before that, I wanted to talk about Amnesty International in their latest report. Michael, you asked what world Christiane Amanpour wants to live in. Amnesty International, it's clear to me that the world they want to live in is a world of totalitarian regimes, because they always criticize the countries that have any basic level of respect for rights, and always let the terrorists off the hook. And we will have a show dedicated to that report. But yeah, right now let's play more of that clip.
In January as a temporary measure. Israel's relentless bombardment of the southern city making it too difficult to carry out a traditional burial. Following the IDF's withdrawal from Khan Yunis, families returned in the hope of finally laying their loved ones to rest, only to find that their bodies had been exhumed by the Israeli military according to civil defense officials, and discarded in this nearby mass grave. I still haven't found my son Khalil's body, this father says. We'd buried him over there, but we can't find him anymore. We just want to give him a dignified burial. According to Gaza's civil defense chief, some bodies have been discovered with their hands tied together. An indication, he says, that these may be the victims of alleged field executions. Though CNN is unable to verify such claims and cannot confirm the causes of...
Wait, actually, do you want to rewind and then play the next few seconds? Rewind like a few seconds and then play a bit more.
Though CNN is unable to verify such claims and cannot confirm the causes of death among the bodies being unearthed. But this would not be the first.
Yeah. You can really get away with anything if you say, but I can't verify it. You know, you just accuse random people on the street of stuff. I mean, look, there are many reasons why somebody might have their hand tied. It could be that they're being interrogated. It could be that they're terrorists. It's very likely that they are rightfully looked at as a threat. But this is not even brought up. What is brought up is whatever the pro-terrorist side is saying that they assume is the reason for this. Michael.
Well, the other reason they might have been hand-tied is because they might have been aiding and abetting the Israelis, or thought to be aiding and abetting the Israelis, which we know is punishable by summary execution by Hamas. And that may well be what happened. Would be unusual, I think, given the situation for Israel to do that. But the question I have is a much bigger question. What point is this here? Are we trying to show that war is terrible? Did Christiane Amanpour do anything similar? And when she went into Ukraine and looked at what the Russians were doing, has she gone into the Sudan and looked at the massacre that's going on there and had a similar problem? That suddenly we have a new right, which is to a dignified burial. That's a new right that CNN just invented. It really, the whole thing is to fill the world with, look how awful the Israelis are. They're beating up on these poor, helpless people. And it really is absurd. And the last bit is that there's not a single part of any of her presentations that remind people that there was a massive attack on October 7th. There was a ceasefire on October 6th, which wasn't a real ceasefire, by the way, because missiles were being shot into Israel almost daily before then, but it was an acceptable number of missiles, which is a whole other discussion. But on October 7th, there was a mass rape and murder and beheading and so forth and kidnapping in Israel. And that's what initiated this war. And war is hell. And part of what happens in war is that you don't know where your people are buried. That's a part of every war. And this notion that the Israelis are somehow unique and awful because they might have unearthed the bodies, maybe it was them, we don't really know, or moved them because they have to find out if the hostages are there, is absurd. And it just adds up to the absurdity of this whole thing.
Yeah. Morgan?
I agree that what is the question about what is the suggestion, because the only explanation which seems to be implied is that the IDF dug up the bodies just to screw around with the corpses, just for the sick pleasure of it, as if there's any credibility to that or any evidence supplied. And the Palestinian rhetoric here, or the Palestinian narrative, gets away completely unquestioned. As you say, the point about people having their hands tied, you know, she gets to say, oh, but there's no confirmed evidence of this yet. Volker Turk, who's the UN human rights chief, said that he was, you know, completely appalled about the discovery, quote unquote, of this grave, and that each of the deaths needs to be independently investigated. But someone else from his office, whose name is Ajith Sunghai, I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, said that he'd seen what was supplied to suggest that people had their hands tied behind their backs, and he said that it didn't meet the UN's standards for being treated as a fact at that point. There just wasn't enough evidence that was credible being supplied. So why on earth is that even reported? To everyone who's hearing this, it might as well just stand as a smear that was just been thrown out completely randomly, with no, as you say, Michael, with no suggestion about who tied their hands or what was the context for them dying whilst having their hands tied. None of that. And yet it gets away being on the mainstream news. why on earth aren't they applying those standards they must have learned in journalism school about what you report and what you don't? Because at this point, could we just sit here, me in the UK, and say something about, Hamas has got a nuclear weapon and they've got their finger on the button? And should Christine Amanpour say, we hear from reliable sources that, Hamas is about to launch a nuclear weapon? It stands with just the same amount of validity as any of these suggestions do. And of course, that's just a lie I just made up. So this is all completely ridiculous, and there is no reflection by the news sources or by the people who are running with it about why did we just believe a load of rubbish. So it's disgraceful.
And if you're going to repeat whatever a Palestinian says to you and then say, well, we have no way of verifying it, why aren't you also at least giving a bunch of other assumptions? Okay, so you're taking the assumption. I mean, this is a very, very, very selective, very selective reporting at every level. Thank you, Larisetto, for the super chat. Larisetto says, deliberately misleading language in these news reports occurred from the beginning of the conflict in Gaza. Yes, that's true, and we brought up and will bring up often the Al Ali hospital so-called bombing, because that should have been a turning point if they were honest about their reporting. Then again, if they were honest about the way they report, they wouldn't have reported it in the first place, because if people tell you a hospital has just been bombed, like in the last few minutes, and 500 people died, they're lying to you, because they could not have counted that many bodies in a hospital that is bombed, and some of them are under the rubble, and there's just no way. But it was reported. Later on, you see some tweaks in how Palestinians, how the nature of their lives. So when we had the what was then called the Flower Massacre, where supposedly Israel shot at people because they were trying to get humanitarian aid that Israel was allowing in and protecting the convoy while it was going on. That numbers there were lower, and so they tweaked it to make sure that their allies in Western media can continue to report it. Thank you, Mary Aline, for the super chat. Mary Aline says this is for the comment I wasn't allowed to send as a super chat, but I don't see that comment. So if Daniel, if you see it, you can send it to me, Mary Aline. If not, text it to me and I'll read it. Should we continue?
Unearthed. But this would not be the first time graves have been disturbed by the Israeli military. The IDF previously acknowledging that its forces have exhumed graves in Gaza in order to carry out DNA tests to identify potential hostages. This man points to the palm tree beside which his brother Ala had been buried. 2 weeks on, and his body has still not been found. Under international humanitarian law, graves must, in times of war, be respected, properly maintained, and marked so they may always be found.
All right, this is this is another interesting point to mention, because they like talking about international humanitarian law and so on, and you never ever hear that ever applied to Hamas, unless I'm missing something. So I have an issue with the very idea that any country, again, if you are forced into war, if a free country is forced into war, they should end that war as quickly and as decisively as possible with as few losses as possible to them. I think many of the rules of war are rules that really help the bad guys, help those who start wars, and don't and hinder the efforts of those who want to defend themselves. But if you're going to say there are rules, why are you only applying them to one side, unless you're trying to make the point I just made? Michael.
Yeah, I would like to broaden that a little bit, because I think we get into a problem that we've talked about on the show a couple of times, and that is that we get into the details of a situation and we forgot to look at the foundations that got us here. There is a tacit assumption or a tacit, and it's well known to be baloney, but it's the way America, the liberal media speaks about Iran and about Russia, even about Russia, about China to some extent, and doesn't touch North Korea, either good or bad. I guess we're afraid they might send a nuclear missile at us, and that would be a problem because we would of course try to catch it, like Biden likes to say, and call that a win. But the bottom line is we act like all of these bad actors are just like we are fundamentally. They're really the same kind of people, that one just happens to want a theocratic autocracy. Another one just wants to have a totalitarian regime. That's Russia. Iran obviously was the theocratic autocracy. You know, China, it's sort of communist, but not really. But don't disagree with them because you'll disappear next day. And they're all kind of the same as the US and Israel and Western Europe. And we're all kind of just bad. And they're kind of bad a little bit and we're bad. And so since we're all a little bit bad, we're not perfect, we all deserve equal treatment. And you start off with this equilibration of morality and what countries are built on, and you get into trouble immediately. This is part of the reason we have the civil guard and these kinds of statements as if Hamas or Gaza has a normal governing structure. It's just like America. They have the Coast Guard, they have the civil guard, they have the post office, they have all these nice people who are professionals doing what they're supposed to do. Iran doesn't really have thought police, and Iran doesn't really have people that go around checking hijab on women, and if it's not placed properly or they're not wearing one, they're suddenly missing or dead or raped. That's all kind of, we don't talk about that because after all, we are also bad here. This has got to stop. We've got to start with the nature of these countries. The nature of Iran and all of its proxies, including Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and so on and so forth, is that they are fundamentally evil. And they have one goal, which is to destroy Western democracies and replace it with Sharia law uniformly. That's the goal. And until you start with that, you're going to come to kind of ridiculous conclusions, which is what ends up here. That's what she seems to want to forget or pretends to forget. She knows all this. She's an educated person, as are all of the people on CNN. They get all this stuff. Why they have chosen a path of making some moral equivalence between these groups of people is beyond me. But instead of us worrying about what their motivations are, we need to call them on it.
Morgan.
I think, and it's just a general way of thinking about the conflict. It's when you're very close, you know, in terms of time, when it's not been a long time since an atrocity has taken place or an alleged atrocity, it's very hard to establish or to reconstruct what exactly happened. And I was reading just recently Benny Morris's book about the 1948 war, and he was talking about Deir Yassin. Now, he reports Deir Yassin kind of according to the typical mainstream account of what happened. But there's a number of other books that have come out in recent years by reputable historians which are disputing that the massacre at Deir Yassin ever took place at all. And they have a lot of archival evidence to make their argument. So, and this is 70 something years after this happened, and these news reports are making much more certain claims than these historians are able to do, even though these historians have looked at vast amounts of evidence and have a lot more time to have, you know, really judged it carefully. But these news sources think they can just make a claim like that, or just report it and say, well, but, you know, we're not totally sure just yet. It's a bit unconfirmed. Especially, and that, you know, this, you have to be very careful, I think, in any conflict about just establishing what the facts are. But particularly with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, both sides are so politicized or propagandized in a way that you need to be just really careful, even more careful than you might have to be in another conflict. But there's no regard given to that at all. And so we'll continue to see this sloppy reporting, which the public will hear and then run with it. And any amendment which they make in the future will not really have any impact. If they were to then make a retraction of the story and say, oh, actually, we went with something we thought was a fact and it turned out it wasn't, that's not going to have an impact on people. People will have seen the anti-Israel line and it'll stick in their heads. And that'll further weigh down against Israel on the international stage.
So Marilene's super chat, which I didn't see and I'm not surprised, is what about traditional burials for those tortured, raped, burned, and massacred on October 7th? Well, that's, you know, I didn't watch Christiana Amanpour report after October 7th, but I can imagine she was more sympathetic in the same way that Israel's so-called allies are very much on the side of Israel when Israel is attacked and as long as Israel doesn't respond. That's the extent of the support Israel gets. I'm actually not 100% certain in Christiana Amanpour's case. There's a comment by Carla in the chat. Carla says, they seem very well equipped with uniforms and masks, etc., for people who are supposedly starving and almost dying. So when the claim that Israel is committing genocide is being brought up, and people point out that the population has grown and so on, one of the things they have these new definitions for terms which help them along the way when they're trying to argue their case. One of the points is, genocide doesn't necessarily have to involve killing a big chunk of the population. So starving doesn't necessarily mean you don't have food. That might be the explanation there. You could be very well fed and starving, and maybe that's what we'll hear in the next CNN report. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Ginger, for the super chats. Let's play more of that report.
To always be found. But in Gaza, the Palestinian people have been robbed of their dignity, even in death.
Nada Bashir reporting there, and the IDF says the claim that Israeli troops buried scores of Palestinian bodies in a mass grave is, quote, baseless and unfounded, saying bodies buried at Nasser Hospital were examined and returned to their place. Of course, in addition, the horrific and soaring death toll inflicted on Palestinians in Gaza, we remember that an estimated 133 Israeli hostages remain in Hamas captivity there.
That's so kind of her. That makes everything okay. The fact that at the end she mentions the hostages. Yeah, a report that supposedly is this is not an op-ed. This is a report this is news. This is they're telling us what's going on. The Palestinian people have been robbed of their dignity, even in death. I mean, that is propaganda, and it's shameless propaganda. And I don't know if anybody watches this and thinks this isn't propaganda, even on their on their side. But yeah, anyway, Michael.
Well, I mean, she also finished up saying the exorbitant, or whatever the word she was, the number of deaths in Palestinians versus the fact that we have 133 hostages, and she didn't mention how many dead Israelis there were, but the fact that we don't have 30,000 dead Israelis somehow is not okay with her. If it were 30,000 dead Israelis and 30,000 dead Palestinians, then maybe it's okay. But it gets back to this whole equivalence thing. They attack us, and we're supposed to have a proportionate number of deaths as they are, the proportion being 1-to-1. That's the implication. It's despicable, it is immoral, and it doesn't even acknowledge the fact that the person who is the aggressor is the one who needs to be punished and destroyed, period. End of story. And if we had 0 deaths, which would be the goal on the Israeli side, 0 on us, and if we have to kill 50,000 people or 100,000 people in order to kill Hamas, which, by the way, could give back the hostages and give up tomorrow, and the killing would stop, but that also is not an option, then it would be perfectly legitimate from a moral point of view. And that goes back to my last comment. The complete and utter lack of acknowledgement of when someone attacks you, you have the moral imperative, not the right, the imperative to, if someone is attacking you with deadly force, you have a moral imperative to annihilate them. That's the way it works. If someone pulls a gun on you, you are perfectly within your right to blow them away. And that's what's missing from this entire discussion.
Yeah. Thank you, Mary Aline, for the super chat. Mary Aline says, I identify as hungry and starving, as do we all, and we are waiting for our UN aid packages from UNRWA to be dropped off, maybe from the air. Morgan.
Well, and as I mentioned before, since we're talking about UN, Volker Turk came out making a statement about this. The other thing that we need to see as a result of this war, and really should have happened a long time ago, is a lot of the major countries which support it and are members saying this is a corrupt organization full of people who are very, very anti-Israel and are letting that enter into the statements that they're making and influence the decisions that they're making. The UN, organization on the ground, UNRWA, was infiltrated by Hamas very clearly for a long time. Its employees were either direct members or affiliated with Hamas. Held hostages in their attic in one case and stole bodies in another, and all this kind of stuff. And yet no such reflection or soul searching is being done. And the UN didn't have moral authority anyway, but has vacated it in the way that they treat the conflict. The fact that this guy, Volker Turk, gets to parade around as the human rights chief, I mean, goodness gracious. I think that there could be a legitimate organization which attempts to do what the UN does, but it would have to look completely different, and it would have to have completely different staff in its various positions. But again, there's either so much confusion out there or just so much agreement with the kind of things that the UN is saying and doing that unfortunately we're not going to see that. And I'm in one of my glum moods, I suppose, because it makes me despair. Like, how on earth are we going to see this change? I think, was it only a representative from Eastern Europe who said that they should leave the UN, and that's the only representative we've seen saying that? Where is the chorus of voices from Western nations saying that kind of thing?
Yeah, that was the Czech foreign minister who said that earlier on in the war. I don't remember exactly the statement, but we did read it out on the show. It was beautifully put, and it's a shame that the countries who need those ideas, need that clarity more than any other, because the Czech Republic having that clarity is not going to impact this war unless they do so as an ally to other countries who also have that clarity. So, yeah. Well, I want to read the tweet that through.
Sorry, Razi, can I just interrupt and add on to what you and Morgan said? Because
Sure.
I think, I don't want to simplify it too much, but I think first of all, the name, I've said this before, the name United Nations is a complete misnomer. And the vast majority of the countries in the UN are corrupt countries, and it is a punching bag for the, quote, countries that are not only trying to aspire to better democracies, that are already democracies and always trying to improve, and also the ones that are paying for the whole UN thing, are outnumbered greatly by the number of bad countries. And the second bottom line point is that until there is leadership in the United States, there is going to be no way to reform that organization. This will never ever change. The European countries separately will not have the guts that the Czech Republic did to speak up, for fear they will piss off the US and maybe get less money from us, or lose some allyship, et cetera, et cetera. And the United States basically uses the UN to be some kind of excuse for listening to all ideas, no matter how absurd they are, which is where we've blown it. I mean, we as Americans have people running our institutions that have no moral clarity and don't understand that words matter. And that's why the word United Nations is such a bad word, because it presumes already that it's a good thing, and it has become a completely bad thing, and it's detestable. And yet it's pervasive and continues to go ahead. And news organizations like CNN and so on, and MSNBC, love to portray it as sort of the referee of goodness in the world. And if the UN says something, it's good, which is not true.
Yeah, Daniel just sent me this statement from Jana Černochová, the Czech defense minister, not foreign minister. This was when there was a vote in the UN. I don't remember which one. There were many votes about Israel. Her statement was, Hamas killed around 1,400 Israelis, and only 14 countries, including us, have taken a clear stand against this terrorist attack. I am ashamed of the UN. There is no place for the Czech Republic in an organization that appeases terrorists and does not respect the fundamental right to self-defense. Let's get out of there. I mean, if only there was such moral clarity again anywhere in Israel, Israel would have won the war already. But unfortunately, there isn't. There's a comment in the chat. Leo says, boot the UN from America. Let's see who wants them. Well, we already proposed on this show what should happen with the UN. First of all, if the US stops paying the UN will be able to do a lot less because something like a quarter of their budget comes from the US. Plus, they're taking up this prime Manhattan real estate that breaks my heart. But also, there's this build. Michael, you know this skyscraper in Pyongyang that was built. It looks like an arrow or a missile. I think as a hotel originally, but nobody visits North Korea or whatever. For whatever reason, that building is not in use at the moment. That is, I think, the perfect place to for the UN to move to from New York. We should move them out as soon as possible. If the US doesn't know what to do with that building, I'm going to volunteer to take care of it. Somebody says in the chat, not one live report, you're all sitting in comfortable Western areas. Yes, but we encourage you, if you want, to go and take up arms. The intellectual battle is important. And if people actually, if policies follow the ideas that you hear on this channel, then this war would be over and the world would be a much more peaceful and prosperous place. Okay, should I read this tweet by Aviva Klampes? This is how I found the Christiana Manpour report. So she says this is an appalling segment from Christiana Manpour. It repeatedly cites the Gaza civil defense, that's a fancy way of saying Hamas, and fails to mention that Hamas hid Israeli hostages in Gaza hospitals. The IDF acknowledged that it examined bodies buried near Nasser Hospital when they searched for the remains of hostages murdered by Hamas. Why is Amanpour providing cover for a terrorist organization? Bottom line, if Hamas hadn't started this war or abducted hostages, Israel wouldn't be searching for their remains in Gaza. Yes, I mean, so much of this is not complicated and shouldn't be complicated. And I don't think Christiana Manpour thinks it's complicated. This is not somebody who I can let off the hook as maybe honestly mistaken, maybe, has been misled. This is not an 18-year-old at a protest somewhere hearing that there's going to be song and dance. This is, an adult journalist who has been doing this for many decades, and she knows what she's doing very well. So, Michael, I think she knows the answer to the question, what kind of world she wants to live in.
Yeah, look, and I know that the comment earlier about us sitting in our comfortable Western offices, which is somehow considered to be bad. I think that statement in and of itself, and I'm not sure which direction you were coming from, but you got to be really, really analytical about the nature of that statement. The reason we have comfortable Western offices is because we come from comfortable Western democracies that have led to essentially all of humankind's progress and success in controlling our environment to the point where we are not all going to starve to death tomorrow and die of disease and freeze to death or die of heat stroke. So let's stop pandering to the baloney media and the baloney notion that somehow being civilized and being in a place that has been successful and maintained that success, meaning we haven't gotten into wars that led to our buildings being rubble, is a bad thing. It's actually a great thing, and that's really what we want. And by the time you're sick next time, think about how it would be if that hospital were run by Hamas terrorists. That's my first point. I just want to make one more point. If you roll out this philosophy that we in our comfortable Western offices are actually, if you project that forward and look at the world that we would live in, it would be more of what you're seeing on this TV, us in our comfortable Western offices, living and thinking about really what are the human rights issues in the world, what are the problems with engineering, how do we help make a better climate, How do we use technology that doesn't pretend that we can shut down all use of fossil fuel tomorrow, but we all recognize we have to get rid of it in the future and we need alternative sources so that these people that you are purportedly so worried about don't freeze to death and don't die of heat stroke. Those are the things that we should be doing. That's what we are doing sitting in our offices. I happen to be a physician who designs new drugs. I make new drugs. I have 3 oncology drugs I've made, that I've helped bring to market in my life that have helped a lot of people live a long time. I've treated lots of patients and so on and so forth. And we all have jobs that we think are important. Philosophy sits at the foundation of all of this. If you roll us forward, you get to good things. To the times when we misuse our power, that is, if we are committing bad things, that needs to be checked. Of course it does. We don't need child labor, we all agree. On the other hand, if you roll forward the Iranian, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthi philosophy and roll that forward, what you end up with is rubble, theocracies run by ayatollahs, women that are covered, gays that are pushed off of roofs, minimal progress in medicine, minimal progress in engineering, and a return to the Stone Age, which is exactly what Ayatollah wants. And we got to come out, we've got to start to say that in the West. Let us wake up and give ourselves, we don't have to have a pat on the back, but just acknowledge that the successes have come from here and we want to do more of it. And on the other hand, we can deal with philosophies that lead to the destruction of civilization and a return to the Stone Age, which is exactly what the theocrats in Iran want, and without the religion, what Russia wants and what China wants.
So this person followed up saying that he served in 11 conflicts, the first being the Falklands, the last being Afghanistan. Now, if this is true, first of all, if you're serving, a country like Britain or the US, certainly we should thank you for your service, but that doesn't mean everything you say is right. And it also doesn't mean that anybody who doesn't serve in the military should not be talking. You don't have to listen. That certainly is an option for you. But the idea that if everybody was fighting in the military and doing nothing else, it'll be a pretty miserable world. And if you don't have ideas behind when it is that you should actually fight, you would also have a pretty miserable world. And we see that already. We see it in wars that shouldn't be fought in the first place, and we see it in wars that should be fought and are not being fought or are not being fought properly. So yes, we will continue to be as comfortable as we can be. Of course, your super chats, and if you become a member of the Ayn Rand Center UK, there's a link in the description. We could be even more comfortable, so consider doing that. Morgan, any parting thoughts?
Well, this person doesn't know that my chair is actually very uncomfortable, which is why you see me shifting around so much. But perhaps now that they know that, they'll take what I say a bit more seriously. Look, that kind of statement is just when someone doesn't like what they're hearing and they'd like to find another way to discredit it. And unfortunately, far too much of what goes on in the discussion around the conflict and more broadly is that people run with their narrative first and then the facts second. And they try to have the facts fit their narrative rather than entertain ones which might be uncomfortable, which might make them have to question it. And when it comes to these reporting, part of the reason why people will just run with it instead of critically think about what's being presented to them and does it make any sense is because it confirms the narrative or the prejudice they already have in mind. So many people are amenable to the idea that just what the IDF wanted to do was dig up some bodies and screw around with them because these are the nasty, sinister IDF Israeli forces. And yet it makes no sense at all that that's what they were trying to do. So people just need to be a bit brave and be willing to consider things that might not be comfortable for them, which is that maybe the Israelis aren't, the world's Satan, and maybe the Palestinians aren't these angelic victims. Maybe the Palestinians in Gaza really did vote in Hamas and really would like to see a lot of the violence go on. And maybe, I don't know who that mother was who was crying, but if she's ever been in favor of Hamas or ever encouraged her boy to go fight for Hamas or fight the Israelis, then maybe in some sense she brought the death of her son onto herself. And we can leave it there.
Michael, parting thoughts?
Yeah, I quite agree that there's a saying, I don't know who to attribute it to, but when things don't add up, check your assumptions. And the assumptions that people like to make, and that's a part of the whole problem with the time we live in, is that people don't want to think anymore. They just want to they somehow believe that everyone else understands stuff, and their job is to just react instead of questioning. And this is one of the reasons that people like government. I personally don't like government. I think government has a very restricted, a very important, essential role. But I think that the government's role has to be restricted. And frankly, the best thing government can do is to get out of people's way and let people flourish and let people create. And this is what happens when you decide that somebody else is smarter than you are and can make better decisions about your life. Like Christiane Amanpour, who clearly is well-educated and clearly morally absolutely corrupt, and I would be happy to debate that with her at any point.
Well, I would watch that debate with a sick bag next to me, considering she will be talking in it. Thank you, PC, for the super chat. PC, we'll use that super chat to make our Western lives a bit more comfortable. PC says, Channel 4 News pushed this story. I haven't seen, I watch Channel 4 News sometimes accidentally, but yeah, Morgan, I think Channel 4 News deserves its own episode of one of these shows at some point, so that our American viewers and our non-UK viewers know the level of which at which the media gets here, which is I think it gets worse than even Christiane Amanpour. And yes, that is possible. We'll leave that as the teaser. If you want to find out more, you need to tune in again to the Daily Objective and the reality show. Michael, quickly, where can people find you?
Best is Michael Kaufman with 2 Fs and LinkedIn, Boston, Massachusetts, Miami, Florida, and Tel Aviv.
Don't give out addresses. I think some people here would be interested in that for all the wrong reasons. Morgan, where can people find you? Again, not physically.
You can, whatever the United Nations headquarters is, you can go to that address and go bother people there if you like. But you can find me on Twitter at MorganCarson98, which will be in the description. You can find my Substack there as well.
I'm Razi Ginzberg on Twitter. Thanks everybody for watching. This is important content. Make sure more people watch it. You can do that by liking, commenting, sharing, and of course, you can support our work by becoming a member. We'll be back tomorrow with the Daily Objective and the reality show. See you then.